Good morning. A very warm welcome to the DGAP morning briefing. My name is Guntram Wolf, and I'm the Director and CEO of the German Council on Foreign Relations. And I look forward to hosting today's debate on Israel, the Middle East, and beyond. Before I introduce our discussion, let me thank the communications and events team and my colleagues Jan Stöckmann in particular and Milanic, who have put this morning briefing together. Thank you for the great collaboration. So we wanted to talk really about the geopolitical implications of Hamas attack and in particular what will come next and the strategic implications in the next weeks, months, but perhaps also years. For that, we have a stellar lineup. We will start with Stephen Erlanger. Stephen Erlanger is the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, and he's joining us from a hotel in Jerusalem. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Guntram.
The next speaker will then be Kerstin Müller. She is a senior associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and a former state minister in the German Federal Foreign Office and an expert on the Middle East and the region. Welcome, Kerstin.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Guntram.
And last but not least, let me welcome Hanna Notte. She's the director at Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome also to you, Hanna.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm the director at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, CNS.
Yeah. Welcome to you, Hanna. Thanks for joining. Well, Stephen, let me really start with you. I mean, you're in Jerusalem and, we've been WhatsApping the last 10 days and you told me, of course, how devastating this Hamas attack has been on Israeli society. So what I want to ask you is really much more about the strategic thinking of the leadership that you are in contact with now in Jerusalem, in Israel. What is their sort of view of the short term, but also what is their view of the medium to long term? What will we see? How will this unfold?
Well, thank you, Guntram, and good morning to everyone. It's very difficult to get across to people the change in mood, in attitude from this country. People talk in loose ways about 10 9/11s. There's a lot of paradigms have been thrown up in the air that Hamas could be controlled, that it could be appeased, that it would somehow moderate, that, as Bibi Netanyahu often said, he would weaken the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank while keeping Hamas quiet, relatively quiet in Gaza. All that's gone. Israel has had its self-confidence challenged, but it's also its credibility in the world challenged. Its citizens have been divided politically for months and months. They've come together here, and the country wants Hamas dismantled in Gaza. Israelis were massacred in Israel proper. They were not settlers. They were not colonialists. They were Israeli citizens, and Israel will fight back. It's quite simple. So the only real strategic question right now for the military is how to go in, how long it will take, how to do it, how to minimize deaths for not only Israeli soldiers, but for ordinary Palestinian civilians. Israel is a country that tries to obey international laws of war. Hamas is not a country. It pays no attention to that. But if Israel only succeeds in dismantling Hamas in Gaza, to me, it won't be a real success until there's some form of political settlement that establishes a kind of stability along that border and with the Palestinians in a larger way. So there's thinking going on. What will happen afterwards? Who will rule Gaza? After all, Israel in 2005 pulled out of Gaza, basically didn't negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, threw the keys into the street. We see how that came out. I think everyone realizes that's not the best outcome now. So I am preparing, I have to say, for a difficult military that's already going on in Gaza. I mean, Israel's bombing in Gaza in ways it has never done before, but a ground invasion, a ground operation that's going to take many, many, many weeks. This is not going to be a slow business. So I think I'll just end it there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen, for these first remarks. I mean, just to follow up, I mean, and give a sense also to our listeners when we talk about the 10 9/11s. I mean, just to do the maths very quickly. So we had 1,300 Israelis at least being murdered by Hamas on a population size of something below 10 million. So if you were to extrapolate that to Germany, the German population size, that would be something like 10,000 people being slaughtered. I think that's a useful sort of number to keep in mind to sort of understand the impact on society. Now, Stephen, I mean, I guess what I'm puzzled about and what I would love to understand better is what is really sort of the real strategic aim to when you go into Gaza. I mean, you mentioned the reaction of the United States to 9/11, which was basically two wars, and where I think now 10 years, 20, 15 years later, the assessment is not at all that positive on how much these wars achieved, in particular in Afghanistan, right? I mean, so sort of if we take a step back, right, and sort of think about what will be achieved by ground invasion in Gaza. I mean, what is the strategic thinking of the military leadership on what they can really achieve?
Well, it was interesting that President Biden yesterday visiting Israel cautioned Israel in much the same terms. He said, after 9/11, we made mistakes. Now, he didn't specify them, but Biden was someone who voted for the Iraq War and then regretted it later. But I don't think Israel is going to be, well, let me directly answer your question. The strategic goal is to rid Gaza of Hamas. Hamas has been controlling Gaza ever since it won a civil war against the Palestinian Authority in 2007. It has ruled with a very, very strict hand. It has diverted aid. It's built a whole tunnel city underground. And Israel intends to remove Hamas from Gaza. It's very simple, and I suspect Israel wants to kill Hamas leaders outside Gaza also. They want to remove political and military influence of Hamas. They can't kill the idea of Palestinian resistance. They're not stupid, but they want to turn Gaza over, ideally, to the Palestinian Authority, presumably, to some sort of perhaps international observer system. But they want a Gaza without this Islamist, religious-based organization, which is committed in its charter to the eradication of Israel on earth.
Okay, a very quick last question, and I know time is running very quickly, but since I have you here, yes. Want to free Gaza from Hamas, but of course, as you yourself say, I mean, they won't eradicate the thinking behind it, right? And so I guess the question is, what's the vision of what comes after? I mean, yes, turning it over to whom and to what kind of organization and who's going to take charge of Gaza and who's going to rebuild it. I mean, that's
everyone's asking these questions. At the moment, frankly, Israel says that's not our concern. People are thinking about it. The foreign ministry is thinking about it. You have diplomats thinking about it. There's if you remember something called UNSO, which is the UN Truce Observer Mission, that still has legal authority in Gaza, though it left in 1996, I think, after the Oslo Accords. My hope, and it's simply a personal hope, is that there will be a radical revision of Israeli politics after this war. I don't think Bibi Netanyahu will escape responsibility, and I think there will be a realization that there must be a better arrangement with Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. And what happens in Gaza, I think, will be the responsibility of an awful lot of people. But Israel does not want to rule Gaza. It doesn't want to stay in Gaza. It wants peace on its border. Now, that's perhaps an impossible dream. It's a hopeful dream. Most hopes get destroyed. But at the moment, everyone's asking this question. But right now, Israel's preparing for war. That's what it's doing.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for these perspectives, really from Jerusalem. And now let me turn to Kerstin Müller. Kerstin, you've been following the region for a very long time. And of course, I mean, just to give a bit of a sense of the German perspective on this, I mean, all main German political parties have been very clear in their support of Israel. The German Chancellor was there. But of course, there is a lot of worry that this will escalate. And there's a lot of worry also about the humanitarian consequences of the war in the Gaza Strip in particular. So give us a sense of where you see the German debate and, what you see as sort of the mid to long-term vision for Gaza and for the region.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Guntram. Well, I think especially as Germans, the Americans, they do it, but especially as Germans, we have to understand what has happened there. I mean, I lived in Israel, I have many friends there. I'm not leaving the phone anymore all day and night. What Israel experienced was the worst attack on its people and land since its existence. They're talking about their September 11th. And politically, it was already said, I mean, going to be a long war. The attack will have long-term consequences, not only for Israel, but worldwide, and also for the Middle East conflict. The region will not be the same after the war, and the parameters will change fundamentally. But what we have to understand, especially as Germans, we're talking about the Staatsräson, is the trust of the Jews worldwide in the Jewish state, which protect its citizens and being the secure home for all Jews in the world, has collapsed overnight and has been massively disrupted. Of course, Israel will do everything, side with the United States and its allies, to restore this trust. But probably it's going to be something like a trauma. And especially for Germans, our first thing is to be, to stand aside of Israel. And somebody said, like, the Staatsräson is on the test now. So I think that's true. And I'm very glad how the political spectrum reacted. The Bundestag made a conclusion where everybody agreed, which is very rare. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, but also Scholz, was the first European leader who has visited Israel in this situation and has expressed solidarity. And I think it's not only a symbolic act to express solidarity, but from there on, you can build again trust and help the Israelis to rebuild trust and tell them, well, we're going to be standing at your side. What is going to meant? Of course, we're going to discuss, but it was deeply important, I think, that he came. And also his words were important. Of course, the visit of President Biden for all Israelis was the most important visit, demonstrating that the US is standing strongly on Israel's side in this terrible situation. But for the Europeans, for us, for Israel, it was also important that Chancellor Scholz was there. And he was also tried to reach something for the release of the hostages. So he talked with Qatar here in Berlin, visited Egypt. He tried to improve already the situation for the Palestinian refugees. And it seems that at least concerning a humanitarian corridor, opening Rafah border to get medicine and food and stuff like that, nutrition for the people in Gaza in. It seems that especially there has been some progress. Of course, it has been President Biden, but I think also the visit of Scholz probably did here something. So I said this attack changes everything in the Middle East. It has a new dimension. I think also we have to ask ourselves, where do we stand? If we look what happened at the outbreak of the conflict, it also means that we, the EU and Germany, are faced with the shards of our Middle East policy. Probably I can go into this later on, but I think really we have altogether make a restart. This will be connected to the question, what comes in the aftermath? What comes after the war? There, I think, will be an important role of the international community, of Germany, of the European Union, and all ideas which have been made, Oslo and so forth, will be on the back on the table, and then, we going to try to find a format how to develop a civilian, a peaceful perspective, especially for the people also in Gaza, but in the West Bank and for the region, taking into account the security interests of Israel. Let me make one more point why it was so, why it's such a special and heavy attack for Israel. The Israelis were, during the past years, living quite comfortable with the so-called status quo. They had adjusted themselves to it, meaning they were convinced if they couldn't solve the conflict with the Palestinians for many reasons, they have to contain it. And in doing so, they trusted in its own military strength, building the biggest defense wall in the world around the West Bank and Gaza, controlling everything which was going in and out, checkpoint system. We all know this. So, and then kind of pretending and thinking that it would be possible to live a normal life on the other side of the fence. But this assumptions that Israel could live with Hamas and manage periodic conflicts with it has been shattered. So also this is kind of gone. The Israelis, everybody has to state the status quo is over. It's over. So the question again has to be raised, what comes next? And I'm sure that President Biden, as far as I know, he participated for hours to the cabinet. This has never been happened before, to the Israeli cabinet, and discussing with the ministers, with the cabinet, with the government, obviously in details, how the situation is, what is going to do, and so forth. But I'm sure that the United States, they have interests in the regions, they have international interests. They will raise this question. They will raise the question, the Israelis are going to go in with a ground offensive, but how will they go in? They have to make the difference. Their goal is the military infrastructure of Hamas and not the people of Gaza. He also said this publicly, and I think he will make at this point. Plus, I think he will raise the issue of the Arab neighbor states. For the US, for Israel, it's important that they kind of stay on board because they're needed for a solution after the war. Sorry that I'm always raising this question, but it's very important. If they go in, and they will go in, as we go in a hard and a long war, where do they want to be in 3 or 5 years? What comes after the war is a very important question for the region, for Israel, but also for us, for the stabilization of this region. Because if it's not going to be possible, how can I say, is like to to avoid a regional war, if it's going to escalate, what I think is the US trying to prevent. They want to demonstrate deterrence and get back deterrence. So if Iran, for example, is going, which is the white elephant in the room, is going to get into this war, then it will have international dimensions. So it's also in our interest. What will be the next steps and how Israel will go into Gaza?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kerstin. I mean, perhaps just one very quick follow-up on Iran, because you and I have been in communication before on the Iran question, and it seems to me that it is now time also for Germany and the European Union to take a tougher line and a stricter line on Iran, a regime that not only actively supports Hamas and Hezbollah, but actually also actively supports Russia, that engages in this terrible war against Ukraine. So just one or two sentences on Iran.
Well, I said that the assumption of Israel, the status quo is possible to live shattered. I think we must realize that also our kind of parameters for the Middle East shattered. Iran is the main spoiler. I mean, imagine the war is going to end in 3 years, probably. I don't know. Nobody knows. Imagine the US can bring everybody together to find a peaceful solution for Gaza, including the Palestinians in the West Bank, including Egypt, including the regional players. What about Iran? If Iran remains the main spoiler in the region, and Iran has no interest neither on a two-state solution. I mean, he's still declaring that they want to eradicate Israel. The problem will be that there will be no peace. Probably there will be no peace for the region. They have their spoilers. We see Hezbollah, and a lot of experts see it like me. The US sent the strongest wie sagt man, Flugzeugträger, aircraft carrier into the region, together with a lot of military staff, to restore deterrence. Sure. And Biden was very clear, don't. So what about us? I think we can't negotiate with a terror state. We have to make us clear. It didn't work. We tried. It was good to try. The JCPOA was important to try to get a peaceful solution, to contain Iran nuclear program over negotiations, but it didn't work out. So now we have to change our policy also towards Iran, and together with the allies, of course, together with the United States.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kerstin. Let's turn to Hanna, and I think it's a very nice sort of bridge that we just had talking about Iran. I would love to hear from you more on Russia, but perhaps I can push you directly at the beginning a bit more broadly on the global South. I mean, on many email threads and social media threads, I get the sense that many countries in the global South feel that the West treats the Palestinians has double standards, right? And is basically losing faith in the West, and is also losing faith, whatever remained, in a pro-Ukrainian stance. I mean, the famous thread was basically around the fact that the Commission President was very critical of the bombarding of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine by Russia. But far less, or didn't mention that strongly in the case of Gaza. So there's the whole question of, how is the global South seeing this? What kind of strategic opportunities are there also for Russia, for China? Where do you see this?
Yeah, thanks, Guntram, for having me and raising those excellent questions. Let me start by saying that I don't think there's really any evidence to say that Russia directly instigated this Hamas attack on October 7th, notwithstanding Russia enjoying long-standing political ties with Hamas. But of course, Russia is a factor here, I would say, and to echo Kerstin's point, by fueling an environment in the region that has emboldened Iran. That has happened against the backdrop of Russian-Iranian intensifying cooperation, including the drone trade that we've seen. What has Russia been doing since October 7th? If you look at the narrative that's come out of Moscow, that has several layers. There's obviously a lot of US and Western blaming and shaming going on. Russia blaming this latest escalation on past Western foreign policy mistakes. Interestingly, they have not named Hamas in their official talking points. They have not even labeled what happened on October 7th an act of terrorism, which is interesting. And if you look at the media messaging, as well as what Russia has been doing quite actively in the UN over the past week, there's a lot of focus on Palestinian suffering, on Palestinian civilians in Gaza. That is where Russia is putting its emphasis, because it understands that this resonates not just across the Middle East, but in the global South. They are being careful not to antagonize Israel too much. I mean, Putin came out and said that Israel has the right to defend itself. The Russian MFA, after the hospital bombing in Gaza, did not attribute this directly to Israel. So Russia was sort of careful in how it played this. But overall, I discern this pro-Palestinian bias in Russian messaging since October 7th. If you look at Russian actions, interestingly, they've been quite active at the UN Security Council trying to push those humanitarian resolutions over the last few days. But Russia is not really engaged here at the highest level. I mean, Biden traveled to the region. Putin is in China. Lavrov is in North Korea. The Russians have been active at the level of deputy foreign minister in Moscow, hosting all sorts of Arab ambassadors, but they're not really engaged at the highest level here. And I would pose to you that Russia has very little leverage in this situation, whether it's on the hostage situation, whether it's on humanitarian corridors. They have little leverage over the players that matter here. And so I would argue that notwithstanding Russia being sort of a side actor, actually, it is now standing to benefit from this war in three ways. The first is the distraction value that Russia gets from this war, getting some, I would say, breathing space in Ukraine, given the diversion of media attention to some extent from the war in Ukraine to this new war in the Middle East. And of course, there's also the concern over whether Western states can support both defensive needs of Ukraine and Israel if we are moving into a long war. And that can only be welcome from Moscow's point of view. The second benefit for Russia here regards regional diplomacy. From what I see and hear, normalization talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia are now suspended. It's unclear if and when those talks will resume. But I think even if they resume, they will become a harder political lift. And the choreography of this normalization was already complicated before October 7th. Now, again, scuttling this US-led normalization effort in the region, that's welcome for Moscow, because Moscow always felt that the diplomacy flowing out of the Abraham Accords was a US project that sidelined Russia, and that Russia does not have any interest in seeing succeed. And now let me come to the third and I think largest benefit, and to your question about the global South. Russia, through its messaging and its efforts at the UN, by distancing itself from Washington's clear pro-Israel stance, and by focusing on the suffering of civilians, as cynical as it is, given that Russia is pushing a humanitarian resolution in the UN Security Council, while Russia at the same time is bombing residential buildings in Ukraine. Notwithstanding the cynicism here, I think Russia is tapping into grievances, not just in Arab societies, but more broadly in the global South, where the Palestinian issue retains considerable symbolic value, where it is seen through the prism of sort of the global dominance of the United States, which is viewed as the main backer of Israel. And so Russia is tapping into that, importantly, in alignment with China, which has also been, somewhat critical of Israel over the past few days. And, Putin is just in Beijing now, and the Russians have said that on this important issue, they will also consult with the Chinese. And the Chinese have fully backed what Russia has done on the UN Security Council these past days. So, I do worry that, especially now after the hospital bombing 2 days ago, where hundreds died, and a lot of governments, Arab governments, immediately jumped at the conclusion that Israel was to blame without actually waiting for evidence to emerge. Public opinion in much of the global south has now been mobilized in a certain direction. A rift is opening between those societies and the West on this issue. And Russia can now tap into that and exploit it in this broader war of narratives without actually having to do very much. But my last point here perhaps is that, so Russia benefits, unfortunately, from the situation. I don't think that they want this war to expand or to sort of escalate into a broader regional war, but I'm happy sort of to expand on that if there's interest.
Wonderful. So we do want to take questions from the audience, so start raising your hands or putting them in the chat. But I do want to have one follow-up question also to Hanna. And that is really if you can say a few more words about China and the China-engineered approach, rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, in my understanding, Saudi Arabia has been talking with Iran after October 7, and there seems to be more strategic coherence and alignment between Saudi Arabia and Iran than there used to be. And China, of course, played a very big role. And I mean, economically, it's very clear why China is taking that bigger role in the Middle East now, because it is by now the main buyer of oil from the region, and it will its role in buying oil from the region will only increase as Europe decarbonizes and the US takes care of its own supply of oil. So the strategic redirection of the region is towards China. Just give us a sense of what you think Chinese leadership is thinking here and how it thinks about this relation also.
Sure. I mean, I think, you're very right to point out that the Chinese have become more active, stepping into the region. I mean, their economic interests are long-standing, but they've never been much of a political, let alone military player in the region. And so they did broker this Saudi-Iranian deal. And they also actually, over the last year, came out and offered their good offices to mediate between Israel and Palestine. I think that China has very little to show for to date for its mediation efforts. Yes, there was a lot of fanfare around this Iran-Saudi deal, but I think there was relatively modest follow-up. I mean, there was the reopening of embassies, but certainly on the Israeli-Palestinian front, it was more talk than actually action. But now the Chinese have come out, I think, quite in alignment with Russia in a pro-Palestinian leaning fashion on this latest crisis. I think that Chinese officials said last weekend that Israel was sort of exceeding the bounds of what is necessary for self-defense in its response to the October 7th attack. They've sort of backed the Russian call for a resolution at the Security Council that calls for an immediate ceasefire, something that the Americans yesterday rejected on the Security Council. The US also lamented that the resolution that was tabled by Brazil in the end didn't even mention Israel's right to self-defense, and China was happy to support that resolution. So I think China and Russia are finding themselves sort of in alignment with much of the Arab world at the moment in terms of how this issue is playing out.
Okay, wonderful, or rather disturbing and troubling, because the world is really moving in a bifurcation, in a much more difficult place where we will really increasingly see two camps. But let's now take questions and get all of our speakers here on the main screen. So I see Hartmut Fischer has raised his hand, so perhaps we can bring him in the room so that he can ask the question directly.
Yes, thank you. I don't quite know how to put it, but with the credibility on the global level, what you were addressing, Hanna, if Israel blocks water and other supplies to 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, the credibility of the West that is supporting Israel, with some slight moderations, be careful, but I mean, that is so out of proportion. And I'm not a legal scholar, but to me, it is a war crime. How can we be doing this? It'll undermine the idea of democracy and respect for human rights worldwide, which is already in question with these new alliances building up. I don't see a good answer to that one yet. I know the situation with Israel is difficult. I know they have to do something. But I don't feel that we're on the right side of this issue yet. Sorry for the emotion.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think it's a very important question, and a question that I certainly ask myself as well. So perhaps, Stephen, can you say something about this? Because you're a diplomatic correspondent, so perhaps that helps.
Yeah, well, the ICRC agrees with you that this is a violation of international humanitarian law. It's one of the reasons the Americans and Biden and Schultz too pressed for a humanitarian corridor, which now seems to be happening. Part of the problem, I have to say, is Egypt. I mean, right. Sisi is terrified. First of all, he hates Hamas. He hates the Muslim Brotherhood. He's eradicated radicalism in a very brutal fashion in Sinai. He has no interest in having Hamas coming into Egypt. He's actually quietly supporting Israel's war against Hamas. Now, he has to be careful because of public opinion, but I share this same concern. I mean, I am hoping that the effort in southern Gaza will include international help and housing and water and food, but I am very much troubled by essentially an original Israeli political judgment from a pretty right-wing government to cut off water, electricity, food, etc. to Gaza. I'm not sure militarily it was the best thing to do. It was intended as an incentive to get Gazans to move out of the north, but it is becoming rather excruciating. Israel apparently has restored water to the south of Gaza. I think international pressure on Israel and Egypt to allow humanitarian aid is crucial, and I hope that will continue.
Guntram, if may I
please add, yeah.
I agree with Stephen. Of course, I mean, first of all, we have to recognize, I think, that Netanyahu to Scholz and also to President Biden now said that they're going to let medicine and nutrition and food into the Gaza Strip. But I think we really also have to see the role of Egypt and also Jordan and the others. They were all very clear, I think, kind of blunt even. They said, we're not going to take the refugees. We're not going to open Rafah, for example, to install refugee camps at the border. If you look at conflicts in the world, that would be a very normal thing. Refugees flee to the border and then they cross the border, and there are international camps, and then the international community together with the neighborhood states can help them. But Egypt said no. So this is also not okay, so to say, okay. to be diplomatic. Yeah, we have to put pressure also on Egypt and Jordan and the Arab states that they can't enclose the Gazan people, but that to no.
I understand, but I mean, I guess the point is still that Israel also has a responsibility in preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, it cannot just be shifted to Egypt. It is also an Israeli responsibility, and I think if there is, if I may say so, if there was to be a real humanitarian catastrophe with tens of thousands dying because of basically lack of appropriate care and medication, I mean, I agree with Hartmut. We will have lost the world on this. I think we should be clear-minded on this, and that's the medium long-term scenario where I really then don't see any good scenario, right? I mean, so anyway, this is just a sort of personal view here, but I think it's an important point, this humanitarian issue, and it's also a question that was asked here by Erika Felin-Schoof. So let me bring that question in, which is sort of how do we evaluate U.S. foreign policy decisions and influence in the situation when it comes to a humanitarian ceasefire as proposed by the UN? Perhaps we can get a view on that. And we have two more questions, which I think we can ask afterwards. So perhaps someone wants to talk about the ceasefire idea. Hanna, perhaps, yes.
Yeah, I followed the issue a little bit at the UN Security Council. And so the United States yesterday stood, I believe, alone in vetoing the draft resolution that Brazil had put forward after a Russian draft had failed to elicit consensus on Monday. And I think there had been considerable back and forth and consultations behind the scenes led by the Brazilians to get this consensus. And the Americans said at the end, they want to see US-led diplomacy, quote unquote, play out in the region, given that Biden was in Israel yesterday. And they bemoaned this lack of reference to Israel's right to self-defense. But they stood sort of isolated on the council, with Russia and the UK abstaining from the text, and China and France voting for it alongside all other council members. And I do think there's a risk here that this is yet further fueling this perception in sort of much of the rest of the world that the US is sort of, neglecting sort of humanitarian concerns in Gaza, notwithstanding perhaps all the right things that Biden also said in this regard when he visited yesterday. I mean, Russia already came out very actively sort of saying, well, if the council had adopted our resolution, which was purely humanitarian in nature on Monday, then maybe we wouldn't even have seen this tragic event, which is, of course, again, I don't want to I think the Russian position here is absolutely cynical, given that they are at the same time bombing residential buildings in Zaporizhia, and it's not even getting all that much attention because the media is now very much focused on Gaza. So the Russian position is a cynical one, yet it is sort of, drawing attention to this humanitarian situation. And I was wondering yesterday whether this was the right decision by the US to not go along with the council on this issue. That's sort of my 5 cents.
I think the US didn't do so because Israel's not going to do it. There will be no humanitarian ceasefire. Because the experience of Israel, I think I know it sounds very hard, but the experience of Israel in the previous wars was that during ceasefires, Hamas is only rebuilding its military strength. Look at the tunnels with the tunnel system, which is under the, if the Israeli look at these trucks, hundreds of trucks, they imagine these trucks are going uncontrolled into Gaza. Of course, it was proved that a lot of stuff can be used militarily and not in favor of the Gazan people. that has happened in the past. So that's probably the reason. But what is going to happen? There will be, I think the Israelis, they should and they will let in controlled humanitarian aid for the Gazan people. And there will be, well, everybody's talking about kind of a safe space in the south. But I think the conflict will go on in the north, and also at the time, we don't know when the ground operation is going to start, but the Israelis also have on their plan how can they free the hostages. So this is also a big issue, which will probably avoid, a very, very tough reaction and going in now. They will try kind of to, how can they release them? How can they find them? And so forth. So, but I don't think there will be a ceasefire. We have to find other solutions in this situation now. The international community.
Thank you. I think that was also an important point. So let me just read a few of the questions. So Götz Schellers is asking, as much as I share the objective to get rid of the Hamas, the past has shown how difficult it is to win any kind of war. Is there a proven military strategy of how to get rid of heavily armed militias like Hamas from a relatively small, densely populated area with tunnel and a sympathetic population? Looks like house-to-house fighting over a very long period. Are there substantiated quantitative estimates regarding expected duration and death on both sides and side effects to the international community and polities? I think that's a very, very big and important military question, and I'm not sure if any of you has sort of the deep military knowledge, but perhaps, Stephen, you have a sense of what the military thinks in Israel about how difficult this will be?
Well, they know it's going to be difficult, but they also are sure it can be done. They can't eliminate Hamas as an idea, but they can certainly do a lot to get Hamas out of power and to disarm it inside Gaza. They can do that. It's going to take a long time. I can imagine a very serious bunker buster bombing campaign to try to blow up tunnels. I can see Israel going in for months now, going, if you like, house by house. It's going to be, I've been in Gaza during previous wars. I know how Hamas fights. I've seen arms and missiles inside mosques and inside hospitals and underground, and they don't wear uniforms, and they pop out of holes in the ground and shoot an RPG. It's a very, very brutal fight, and they've prepared for it. I'm sure that this was part of their plan. They've been preparing for quite a long time. I must say, to the detriment of the civilian population. Everyone talks about Gaza as an open-air prison, which it is, but it's an open-air prison in which somehow Hamas managed to import rockets, technology, weapons, arms that they cannot manufacture themselves. So, there's something cynical about all of this. But yes, I think the Israeli military, which has always been reluctant to go deeply into Gaza for all the reasons that everyone has said, and what happens next, and they don't want to occupy it. I just have to say, this massacre of Israeli civilians inside Israel, I cannot state it clearly enough, has, as the French said, changé les donnes. It's changed the assumptions. This is not a war that's going to be like previous Gazan wars. And I shudder about it, but I would just tell you, brace yourselves.
Okay, so we have a few more questions, so let me get them. So there is a question, perhaps I put that one first, by Angela Meekley on the Palestinian Authority. Isn't the Palestinian Authority responsible for basic structures? Hamas uses parts of water pipes to build bombs, consciously risking the lack of water for the population. That has been also quite a bit in the social media. So I don't know, Kerstin, do you have a view on sort of because it touches again on this question of who has to take responsibility for the basic needs of the population in Gaza, and of course we know that Hamas has misused some of the infrastructure and is therefore, of course, a significant responsibility. But do you have any sense of how to answer that question?
Normally you would say Hamas is responsible for the humanitarian, for their people, but I mean the death of their own people is priced in. No, if you look at what they did, they want to drag Israel into this very, very difficult war. They try to prevent people fleeing from the north into the south to do this. They didn't build they built tunnels instead of bunkers or schools with the same materials. So the suffering of the Palestinian people is priced in this cynical policy of Hamas. To look again a perspective after when Israel withdrew from Gaza, of course the idea was that Fatah, that the Palestinians from the West Bank would take over. They weren't prepared. A lot of discussions you can have on this. Therefore, Stephen said nobody is discussing it, but I think this question, what comes after and who is going to take over? What role will the Palestinian Authority play? How can they all together develop a peaceful perspective for the civilians in Gaza is very important. But they don't play a role, in Gaza now, but they should definitely play a role after the war. If it's possible, really to fight destruct the military infrastructure and to really weaken Hamas. We don't know.
So we have a question on the hostages and whether anything could be done to save the lives of the hostages. That question was asked by Sonja Grabowski. I don't know who feels most comfortable with that. Stephen, perhaps, yes?
Well, there are discussions going on through Qatar about the hostages with Hamas and Israel. Hamas has talked about being willing to release women, children, and foreigners, but nothing's happened yet. I think Hamas wants to delay all this for obvious reasons. The Israelis are gathering intel about hostages. I think, what their first concern will be to rescue the people that they can track. Now, obviously, the hostages have been separated and nobody knows exactly where they all are. But of course, Israel did capture some senior Hamas fighters and I'm sure are interrogating them, probably not very softly, about where the hostages would be taken and so on. So you've already had some raids. I think you'll have more raids. And at the same time, I think Israel, which has normally valued its hostages, its soldiers, dead or alive, enormously. They negotiated for more than 5 years to get Gilad Shalit released at the cost of releasing thousands of Palestinian prisoners. I think in this case, they are going to do what they can, but if the hostages in the end are a sacrifice, I think that's one Israel unusually is going to be willing to make.
Yeah, so look, there's one last question, which I think is relatively easy to answer, which is about a possible change of president in the US and what the consequences of that would be. Nikolai von Schöpf is asking, well, in Ukraine, we know that the Republican Party seems to be more critical of engagement. Is there sort of division, what to expect from a possible Republican president in the Near East after 2024. And I mean, I guess my first reply would be that the support for Israel is bipartisan and is shared very much across the entire political spectrum in the US, which is not the case for the support of Ukraine. And I think that's a significant difference, certainly, which to my mind, and I wrote a little op-ed on that, means that the European Union and Germany in particular need to take a much bigger leadership role in supporting Ukraine. I mean, we are doing a lot, of course, already, but there's a real risk that the US will gradually or even abruptly disengage from the fight and the war in Europe. And then, of course, it will be on us Western Europeans and Central Europeans to provide what is necessary to Ukraine, because, of course, it is our security that is at stake and not and Ukraine is really helping us, supporting our security. Okay, so we have 3 more minutes, and of course, it's the last 3 minutes where I get another 3 questions or so. So it's I don't think I can take them all, but I think we do have perhaps one question for my colleague Milanic, who is asked about the question for broader strategic effect of this war on the worldwide contest between the forces of order and disorder. So where's the international system going? If Hamas succeeds, what will be the lessons for others? And, what lessons to draw for China and Taiwan? So, okay, a very easy question at the end. Perhaps, Hanna, you want to say a few words on that?
I mean, just a few scattered thoughts. I think the Western societies and Ukraine have sort of had 2 overarching narratives of what is happening in the world. One is that the rules-based international order is on the line in Ukraine. And now with this latest escalation in the Middle East, that there is a Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas axis from which sort of evil emanates, and tension and instability and war. And, while I think those narratives might resonate in Western societies, again, I want to come to my earlier point, which is that is not, unfortunately, how these conflicts and these situations are seen in much of the rest of the world. And my worry is that the more this war becomes very ugly, and I mean, Stephen and Kerstin have spoken to its potential length, and that the ground operation in Gaza is very likely to happen, I think the more Russia and other actors will tap into this perception of Israel being the occupying force that is acting unjustly against Palestinians, and the more our narrative of a rules-based international order being at stake will be a really heavy lift to carry. I'm not so sure that China is going to be much affected by this Hamas-Israel war in terms of its own calculations regarding whether or not to act vis-a-vis Taiwan. But certainly, I think this multiplication of crises and instability in other parts of the world, and now with the Middle East, I think is ultimately benefiting Russia in this contest over Ukraine, because Russia tries to fuel global pressure points and sources of distraction in order to wear down Western unity and stamina in supporting Ukraine. So that does worry me.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. So if any colleague wants to have one final thought, please do so. I mean, I really have to apologize to those questions coming in at 9:29. I cannot post them anymore because we really simply do not have the time. Our time is over in 30 seconds. So Kerstin, perhaps one last thought, and then we close.
Well, I share absolutely your view that the West is confronted with the axis Iran, Russia, and China, and we have to give a common answer. Militarily, politically, strategically, this is the big challenge in the future. You mentioned details about it. If the US comes getting more involved in the Middle East, there's probably more responsibility for us, for Germany, for the European Union, to support stronger Ukraine. but we have to talk about this, because it's getting more complicated than it has been before. So that's a very important point, I think.
Okay, let me just say a big thank you to all three of you, Hanna, Kerstin, Stephen. It's been a fascinating and wonderful conversation about a very difficult and sad topic. And so thank you for taking the time this morning to discuss this with me and our audience. Very much appreciated. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.